Hi, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to Mornings with O'Keeffe with the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum Learning and Engagement Department. My name is Grace. I'll be your moderator today. I see we have some introductions popping up in the Q&A. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I'll publish those in a second. First, really quick, I'm going to introduce you all to the program. So I would like to begin by recognizing the lands of the Pueblo people on which the sites of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum stand. We recognize and honor their elders, past and present, and celebrate the vitality of their people today and into future generations. I offer this with humility and gratitude in acknowledgement of the need to confront the ongoing injustices of settler colonialism. I would like to extend a thank you to our members and donors who are here today. Your support made this event possible. And if you're not yet a member and enjoy this program, please consider joining today. You can visit us on our website, o'keeffemuseum.org/membership to learn more. Throughout this talk, we do have the chat disabled today. We are expecting a very high number of people. So to limit distractions, we have the chat disabled, but we have our Q&A section enabled. So if you'd like to share a comment throughout today's lecture, you're welcome to share it in the Q&A. And I'll do my best to publish it as we go. However, if you have a question for our speaker today, you can also share it in the Q&A section and we will answer it at the end of the lecture. So we'll try to answer as many as we can at the end of the conversation. But if we don't get around to it, feel free to email us if it's a pressing question at contact@o'keeffemuseum.org. Please note that following today's talk, a recording will be made available on the website, o'keeffemuseum.org, in about a week's time. We will also make sure to email you once that is up. Captions in English are available for this lecture as well. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Elizabeth Lay. She is a newly retired curator at Montgomery History, specializing in American decorative arts. She's a regular speaker on design topics for Smithsonian Associates and the host of their Lunch with the Curator program. Her research focuses on 20th century design and material culture with an emphasis on creative women working between 1915 and 1965. Additionally, she holds a master's degree in the history of decorative arts from the Smithsonian GMU program in design history. And she is an adjunct professor at George Washington University, teaching women designers of the 20th century. So it's my pleasure to introduce you your guest speaker for today, Elizabeth Lay.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to talk about my favorite subject, which is 20th century design and modernism. And modernism emerged early in the 20th century. It was very much a part of our lives: music, theater, dance, graphic arts, architecture, and design. And I'm going to let other experts talk about fine art and the performing arts. But today we're going to focus on architecture and the decorative arts. And I know the decorative arts sounds like it's a problematic name, to tell you the truth. And especially for those of us who study 20th century, which was sort of the antithesis of decoration. But for purposes of museums, we're looking at things different from fine art that are functional, things that are designed to be reproduced. And that includes a vase, a chair, even a car when it overlaps with industrial design. And let's take a look at what I brought with me today. There we are. So, shared aesthetics, and what we're going to take a look at is modernism. We're going to look at its beginnings, the seeds of modernism as they take place in Europe. We're going to look at its evolution, which moves to the United States. And we're also going to see how immigrants inspired what we consider an American style or mid-century modern. And then we're going to take a look, we're going to drill down very specifically and take a look at the choices that Georgia O'Keeffe made in her decorative arts decisions, her interior design. And when you look at these things, I think this was one of the things that I enjoyed most about putting together this talk, was pairing the pieces that she chose for her personal life in her home with her artwork. So now let's take a look at modernism. Modernism specifically as it takes place in design. There's an early modernism that ultimately becomes named the International style. It's primarily architecture. There's very little of furniture yet in their ideas. It's mostly architects. The second generation, which is inspired by the seeds of the first wave, and at this point it begins to come to the United States, and we'll take a look at that. And then there's postmodernism, which one of my favorite quotes about that is Tom Wolfe, where he describes that the name postmodern only describes what it's not what it is. And that's very true. And that's a little bit problematic about that name as well, because modern technically means what's happening now. And so we'll struggle with that a little bit further. But the beginnings of this take place most notably in the Bauhaus, which is never entirely true. We always build one idea on the next. And in fact, what they were doing is standing on the shoulders of the arts and crafts movement. The reason I have Cranbrook Academy on here as well is that helps us look at the second wave. So let's start with the Bauhaus. There's, as I mentioned, they're taking the ideas of the arts and crafts movement, the ideas that art is equal to architecture is equal to craft. And in fact, the building that I'm showing in this image is the second stage of Bauhaus. There's an earlier movement of Bauhaus that began in 1919 with a manifesto from Walter Gropius about, and in many ways, it's a socialist idea. So the design is for every man. It's all equal. We should be, the school was set up primarily by a lot of young men with socialist ideas. They're in their late 20s, early 30s, with the exception of Kandinsky, who is a new immigrant escaping socialism, well, Bolsheviks in Russia. So the first movement of Bauhaus is really focuses on individual ideas, individual art expression, and emphasis on craft. That craft is equal to art, and you should learn to do those techniques as well as design. The design shouldn't only be in paper. You should understand it from an organic level. They had masters instead of professors. They had workshops instead of classrooms. But what happens in well, let me go back just a little bit. This building, the first wave, as I said, is individuals. The second wave, which is this building, 1926 to 1932, they were in partnership with the city of Dessau. So they have public money, and they also have a partnership with manufacturers union. So this is what most people think of as Bauhaus. It's an industrialization of design, a move away from the craftsman to manufacturing. Interesting thing about this is, and it's ironic, that the only portion of the school that was actually profitable in a production way was the textile workshop. And the reason I say ironic is Gropius in his manifesto thought women should be on an equal standing with men. So women flooded the school with applications. And were accepted, but the masters weren't all on board with that. So what they did was create the textile division, and that's where they tried to keep the women. Women wanted to study in this way. They didn't offer initially degrees because you came to the school already with a degree. So because of World War I, there were a lot of women that were filling the seats in universities and taking fine art. So there were a lot of women who came to the Bauhaus qualified and wanted to learn from the teachers like Eaton and Kandinsky and Paul Klee and Gropius, but they weren't entirely embraced. So it is interesting that it's the textile division that is much more successful in this idea of industrialization. But what happens after this date, the 32, there's one more year, the Bauhaus. At that point, it's Mies van der Rohe. The Nazis have determined that there are too many socialist ideas in this. This is a degenerate idea. And these architects primarily and artists had to flee. And it was easy for them to come to the United States because we had already, MoMA had already done an exhibition. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the best way for them to be able to come here was in teaching positions. So what happens is they kind of fan out around the United States in a way that creates this network of ideas that are teaching the next generation of architects and designers, which is very important to the American style. So Walter Gropius goes to Harvard. This is an example of some of his work, an early factory in Germany. And then one of his later works, the Pan Am building, which if you think this was the ultimate 1950s, there was a helipad on the roof. It was right over the train station. This was the modern way of working. Marcel Breuer was also at Harvard. He came with Gropius. He was first a student at Bauhaus and then an instructor. And he created one of the few pieces of furniture that we have from this period that remained. This is known primarily as the Wasserli chair. It got its name because Vasily Kandinsky was the first person who bought the chair. Marcel Breuer, in fact, called it the club chair B23. It was made with bicycle parts or bicycle tubing. And the strapping on the initial chair on the right-hand side was actually woven in the textile department and coated. And so you have really a very heavy-duty canvas on the chair. And on the left, you see a more modern version of the chair, which has the leather strapping. So this is a design that is, in fact, 125 years old. I mean, from 1925, so it's 100 years old at this point, and still going strong, still purchased quite often, particularly by architects. This is the Marcel Breuer, the Whitney Museum. While this might look a little stark from the outside, as a museum, this works really well because the lack of windows, a lot of wall space. This is kind of the ideal for a museum, late 20th century. It started out as the Whitney Museum, then it became the Breuer with the Met, and now it is the Frick. The Annie and Joseph Albers were also part of this group that had to flee. They went to Black Mountain School in North Carolina. He taught color, and she was a textile designer and maker and artist. If you've studied art, you've worked with his color theories. In the upper left-hand corner, you see one of his studies, and the blocks that you see in the center, the brown blocks, are exactly the same size and the same color. And what this illustrates is how color reacts in relation to other color. This is probably an image that was taken from Yale, which is where he went later. This is an example of Annie Albers' work. This was from 1926 while she was still at the Bauhaus. She was initially a student and then a professor there, or a master there. And of course, Mies van der Rohe, who his phrase, less is more, is what we identify so much with modern design and what modern architecture looked like at this point. He was in Chicago, so was Moholy-Nagy and a number of others working in textiles. But we're going to focus on him at this moment. And this is the German pavilion, the Barcelona International Exhibition from 1929. And this is a perfect example of what the modern ideal is for architecture. Rather than having symmetry of mass that's on a central axis, now space is contained with planes, and there's more emphasis on textures, space, vistas. This is not the original, which was disassembled, but this is a recreation of it. And when you have a space like that, what you need, you're not going to be able to put a camelback sofa or a wingback chair in this space. It's going to be incongruous with the space. So what they designed was a chair that worked in a space like this. It supports the architecture. It's beautifully graceful. And he also designed these tables with a glass top, so your eye is going through the table. The real emphasis you see here is on the architecture. He went to Chicago and he was asked to head the architectural school, which became the Illinois Institute for Technology. He designed all of the campus. This was building from 1956. And he inspired a lot of students here. We'll see some of them later. This is the Farnsworth House that he did it took a while to do this house, 1945 to 1951. It was near the river. So you see these floating planes in space and the view that goes through the house into the landscape. This is this is Philip Johnson, who was one of the curators for the exhibition, and that comes in a little bit later, I'll show you. But it shows how this idea is beginning to gain footing. But you also see how stark this is. This movement of modernism is very intellectual. It has a very cerebral aspect to it. It's not really about a comfortable way of living. In fact, Farnsworth sued Mies van der Rohe later because the house did not really function very well. It didn't have closet spaces. It was much too open. But as an object, as an art object, it's really stunning. So this is Johnson's version of it. But here, let's take a closer look at the Barcelona chair. It's a really elegant space, object in space. It was an evolution of this design. There are several versions of it working through. And this is the 1953 version that was produced by Knoll. There were a couple earlier versions produced by Knoll, but there wasn't an official letter of agreement until 1953. But this chair is most likely designed by Lily Reich, certainly in collaboration with Mies van der Rohe. But Lily Reich was his domestic partner. She was his partner in teaching at the Bauhaus, and she was his partner in his designs. And while Mies van der Rohe focused primarily on the architecture of a building, her role, she was also an architect, focused primarily on the interiors and the furniture. So it's very, very likely that she was the primary force behind this chair and the evolution of this chair. And I am advocating that Knoll actually adds her signature to their pieces of furniture when it's produced in the future. This was a really important exhibition. This was the exhibition that brought these ideas to the United States. So this is the Museum of Modern Art. It's a new museum at this point. It's only been open a couple of years. And this is where this design idea gets its name, the international style. This exhibition included Mies van der Rohe, Corbusier, Gropius. There were 40 architects in the exhibition, and they represented 15 countries. It was interesting, as a scholar, you want to look at your primary sources. And so initially I was looking to the original catalog that went with this exhibition in 1932. And it was interesting to see. Recently, I bought the third edition of this catalog. There was a second one in 1966. This exhibition was put together by Barr, who was director of the museum at the time, and Philip Johnson, and oh gosh, I can't, Kaufman. And so it was it wasn't Kaufman, it was Hitchcock. Kaufman came along later. But so it was Henry Russell Hitchcock right there at the bottom of my screen. Anyway, that's what happens. He wrote the introduction to the second edition, which came out in 1966. And Philip Johnson did an introduction to the book, the edition from 1993. And it's interesting to see their ideas looking back on this movement of modernism. In the beginning, these are three young men, fairly young men, and they're zealots about modern design. This is something new and exciting, and they're introducing it in the United States in a very professional, well-researched way. As these men look back, they see, Johnson in particular said that by 1950, he was bored with this version of modernism. And he then takes the Venturi idea of modernism, where less is more becomes less is a bore. He outright says he's a little bit bored with this idea. It's very cerebral. So what happens is, after this exhibition, it's not long after that before all of these designers and architects from Bauhaus end up in the United States, and they begin teaching here. And we've talked about the schools that the Bauhaus masters have gone to teach in, but there's another school here in the United States that's opening about the same time. This one is the Cranbrook Academy of Art. And Eliel Saarinen, also a European immigrant from Finland, but unlike the Bauhaus masters and architects, he's not leaving because of oppression. He's come here for opportunities. He is the best known architect in Finland in the 1922. He comes to the United States to work on the Chicago Tribune, and he meets George Booth, who is developing this idea, which ultimately becomes the Cranbrook School, that is a community also based on the ideals of the arts and crafts movement, that the maker is the designer. And he is creating a city where the instructors and the students and the makers and the artists are all living in community. So there's a church, and there's a elementary school, a boys' school, a girls' school, a university that isn't able to give a degree initially, much like Bauhaus, but they're looking for people who have already gone to college in design and in art, and this is their continuing education. His ideas are, he's a little older than those in the Bauhaus for the most part. And so you can see from this interior, there's still a little bit of Art Deco in his work. This is his home. He came with his wife, Loha, who was a textile designer and maker, and was the director of the commercial division for textiles at Cranbrook. So you see her work in the center. But he also comes with his son, Eero Saarinen. We're going to talk about in a minute. So here are the next generation of designers and architects in America, and largely responsible for the pieces that we're going to look at today, but very much this American style. Saarinen was looking at things he believed in, that the spoon should relate to the dishes on the table, should relate to the table, should relate to the rug, should relate to the room, and to the building itself. So there's this very integrated idea that all of these things there's an integration of all of these ideas, not a separate, this is architecture, this is a chair, this is wallpaper. So let's take a look at some of these folks. There's, of course, Eero Saarinen, who's a little older than the others in this group. He's already working as an architect. And in the center, you see this, oh shucks, good-looking man on the left, which is Charles Eames. They collaborated on a number of things together. Eames had been studying architecture and had done a European tour, had come back and was first as a student, and then very quickly was working as an instructor at the school and a collaborator with Saarinen on a number of projects. On the lower right-hand corner, you see Ray Kaiser, who had been studying with Hoffman and as an artist, and was on her return to California, was told that she should really check out this school, Cranbrook, and she stayed for a year or so, and that's where she met Charles Eames. So then we have Harry Bortoia. We're going to take a look at his work. He's another immigrant from Italy. He came by way of Canada, where he studied design and art. He considered himself an artist and a sculptor more than a designer. And he came to the school, he was brought to the school by Saarinen to head the metal shop work. And the upper left-hand corner is Florence Schuster Knoll. She came to the school, she was an orphan. She was orphaned at 11, 12 years old. She came to the school as a boarding student at the elementary school. And because the Saarinens were very outgoing people, they really looked at the entire school as part of a family. But Florence Knoll in particular, that she was interested in architecture. She had a very lively personality. They brought her into their family and adopted her in an unofficial way. She spent the summers with them in Finland. So she's really absorbing this in a massive way. And she probably has one of the most exceptional pedigrees of a designer architect of this time period. She grew up with the Saarinens. She went to the Cranbrook School. After she graduated from Cranbrook School, she went to London to study with Gropius and Brewer. But then when the war broke out and she had to leave London, she went to Chicago and was she walked to school every day with Mies van der Rohe, and she said she learned more in conversations with him every day than she did in anything else in her life. So she is very, very well equipped to take her skills and to be responsible for a lot of the creation of mid-century modern. This is the Knoll showroom, and you can see here chairs by Mies van der Rohe, Marcel Breuer, Saarinen, Bortoia, Gary, she's presenting this into all our lives. So there's a second exhibition with the Museum of Modern Art, 1939-40, and this is organic design in furniture. And this was a real turning point for furniture design with an American point of view. There is an entry, a chair entry, which we'll talk about later, that is a collaboration between Saarinen and Eames. And the chair, their thesis for the chair is that a chair looks the way it is because it's a wooden frame, your typical chair, and it's upholstered enough to make it soft to sit in. Ergonomics also becomes part of this second wave of modernism, that a chair should be comfortable enough in its design that it doesn't need a lot of upholstery. They design a chair that is a compound curve plywood. And what they win first prize with it. But one of the stipulations of this exhibition was that the chair that wins the design, or all the furniture that wins the design, has to be able to be manufactured. World War II, the United States enters World War II, and that is probably what saved them, because this design, while it was the beginning of a lot of other designs, and it was very important in that way, it couldn't be manufactured in the way that they had hoped. And they tried many, many things. And we'll look at those in a few minutes. But the other thing that's happening post-war in the United States is that we're looking at the world in a different way. We have all of these GIs that have returned. They're getting college degrees through the GI Bill. There are subdivisions that are bursting out, suburbs all around the United States. And there are these houses that are being built very quickly, and they're small, and they have a completely different way of living. And this guide to the Marion Russell Wright Guide to Easier Living. Mary is an Einstein. She's the niece of the great physicist Einstein. And Russell comes at this by the way of an artist and actually theater design. They both give up their earlier careers. She was an artist, and they begin working on design together. They developed through this book, they take a look at the Emily Post idea of what your house should look like, what entertaining should look like. Emily Post has a diagram for 14 pieces of silver flatware and 3 to 5 glasses with information on how to tip the maid at a house that you're spending the weekend. These are no longer relevant to our lives. This is the Wrights are saying this is a European way of life, and we are going to look at things in a modern suburban life. And so you have these more open plans that, as these houses are popping up in the suburbs, the nightlife that they once had when you're living in a city doesn't exist yet. That follows the population. It's not in the beginning when these things are popping up. So there's this new way of entertaining in your home. And that's why people are showing up in high heels and dinner, blazers, and in a formal way, but entertaining in an informal way in their homes. So you take a look at this. The woman is often cooking in the kitchen and serving from there while she's dressed. So there's informal dishware that comes, this idea of design is about the materials. There's little ornament. It's down to the essence that you can pour something by the shape. We also have fine china. This is Eva Zeisel. This was also promoted and sponsored by the museum, the MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, as a new way of entertaining and a new way of presenting porcelain. And there's also this bit of humor that begins to come into decorating. This is Town and Country by also by Ava Zeisel. On the left, you see a salt and pepper shaker. On the right, the oil and vinegar. And you begin to see it in advertising. This is the Eames. On the right-hand side, you see, rather than a static advertising photograph for a page in a magazine, they have this mix of they've created a composition with the chair, and she's added this bird that really kind of makes this appealing and makes it pop. So things are beginning to look different in our homes. This open movement of design, which is definitely based in the earlier modernist idea, the Mies van der Rohe, but now it has a lot more texture. It has a lot more interest. There are things that here that are taken from other cultures. You'll see this in Alexander Gerard's home. He felt like art should be about living. It should be about comfort. And you see this in his home. It's much more relaxed. This is his home near Georgia O'Keeffe's. And you can see why Alexander and Gerard and O'Keeffe would fall into a friendship. They have a very similar aesthetic. He's also responsible for what we can, in the 1960s, that conversation pit. And if you look at the architecture, this is the Miller House, and you see this in the Eames as well and others. The surfaces are fairly neutral. The floor is neutral. The walls are neutral. The lines are clean, but there's these interesting textural pops of color and interest. Look at all of these pillows that are, there are indigenous designs there from America, from South America, from Poland. This is Alexander Gerard, his image for Herman Miller. And you see, there's such beautiful black and white photography in this period with portraits, but this drapery behind him actually looks like this. He's an architect, but he was trained, he grew up he was born in New York, grew up in Florence. His parents were collectors and antique dealers and art dealers. And then he comes to the United States. So he has degrees in architecture from Rome and from London, and then ultimately from the United States. And this is more of his work. You see that there's a little more livability. There's a little more life about this. There's something that makes you, draws you in on this, that is less intellectual and more about the heart. He designed this collection early. It was designed in 1963. They were produced more recently. This is from Live Auctions. This is another picture from Gerard's house, and we're going to take a look at this chair a little more closely later in our talk. But I just want you to see, this is a room that is meant to show off the objects, the decorations, the things that are going to spark conversation. He collected folk art and ultimately created a museum where he donated 130,000 objects of folk art to the museum. So you see, this is about living a joyful life. And his house changed regularly, that the objects were moved around, but he still had this palette that would accept all of these more interesting things. So now let's look at the shared aesthetics. This is the Georgia O'Keeffe house, and she was very sparing in her design, very much like in her art. It was down to the essence. The objects were few, but they were important, and they functioned or in her life, or they weren't in her life. Like I said, this is one of the things that I've enjoyed so much. This is the Barwa lounge chair, which is part of her collection. The one on the right is actually from the Smithsonian, but you can see it in relationship to her artwork, and the lines are significant. There's nothing frivolous about this. It's the essence of what we see. And in a chair, it's the essence of what we need. This is her chair. It's a chair that was designed to be indoors or outdoors. It's an aluminum frame. She's put a pillow on top of hers and uses the canvas as a base. There was an auction at the Richard Wright auction where someone had used the Barwa chair and then had an animal skin, a fleece over the top of it. So people used it both indoors and outdoors. This is the one from the Smithsonian. The designers were Edgar Bartolucci and John Waldheim. This was a design from 1947. The material on top is canvas. It looks as if it's stretched, but in fact, the back of it is pulled taut. And the materials are very, very humble. This is aluminum tubing. These are springs, a washer here in the center that connects it, grommets. And on the inside, if you want to see how these chairs are made, there's a wonderful YouTube video of, I think, 5 parts. But in the second part, they take apart this canvas, and running inside the channel is a chain, the kind of chain that you'd find at Home Depot. So these were minimal, approachable things that were easy to live with and affordable. And that's what became difficult in both the arts and crafts movement and in the international style when it came to furniture, is they were so expensive to manufacture, where the goal was the everyman, the democracy, socialization of furniture. But in reality, those things were expensive. And this is where it finally, in American production, begins to take hold, that idea of democratized furniture. This is Harry Bertoia's chair. Harry Bertoia, we talked about earlier, Cranbrook. This is his bird chair design, 1950. He considered himself an artist that worked in air with metal. And I love that quote. I think that really does describe his furniture. He left Cranbrook and went to California with the Eames. However, even though the aesthetics worked together, their working styles were very different, and it wasn't a success. And Florence Knoll recognized, because she knew all of these men, she recognized that what Bertoia needed was space to create and a stipend to maintain him until there were designs that were ready for production. And so that's what she did. She gave him a studio at Knoll, and he created both artwork there and his sound sculptures, which there was a large auction at Rago Wright outside of Philadelphia recently, and got a chance to see the sound sculptures and be able to hear the sound sculptures. And I think that's one of the marvelous things about an auction house, different from a museum, is that you're able to really interact with the objects in a brief time period, where in museums, sadly, we have to keep them separate from the public. But you could see this chair. It reminds me of a warbler. This is her chair, Georgia O'Keeffe, and the ottoman. And you can see why she would appreciate this chair. It is a very comfortable chair, and it's a very beautiful chair. It's a very beautiful form. This is Bertoia's diamond chair for Knoll. And this is what the base underneath of that chair is taken from, but there's something up there sort of takes flight even in this form. And it's more comfortable than it looks. And on the left is the Eero Saarinen design for Noel. This is the womb chair. Florence Knoll gave him the brief, Eero Saarinen. She knew he was very busy, but she wanted a chair that acted like a wingback chair, that gave you that feeling of being protected, of being able to sit back and be comfortable. And that kind of gave you shelter. And he came up with this magnificent design that's still in production. This is his chair. This is not chair, this is the table. One of the pedestal series, Eero Saarinen. He felt like tables and chairs had a ghetto of legs, and he wanted to create something that was beautiful and graceful and did not litter an area with a lot of legs to the ground. And that's when he came up with this design. And you can see, I love seeing it in contrast with the Georgia O'Keeffe painting. This is the chair on its own from Knoll. Has a marble top and a plastic leg. Here you see it in relationship with the Barwa and the Bertoia in her bedroom, Georgia O'Keeffe. And you can see how this makes sense in her design aesthetic, how beautifully it works against that painting and the sculpture to the left, and even the landscape out the window. This is some of Eero Saarinen's other work. This is the Dulles Airport. I love seeing it in this light at night because I'm so used to seeing it in the bustle of the daytime. And this was the TWA terminal at the John F. Kennedy Airport. But this is the chair that I was saving for last. This is the Eames chair. It is on a low base. There are the Eames. Speaking of humor, this is a wonderful photograph of the two of them. This is the original chair that was designed by Eames and Saarinen. And it was, originally they wanted to create it with a plywood with these compound curves and no upholstery. But as they were making these curves work after much experimentation, they were getting splinters and problems in the surface that they ended up having to upholster it for the exhibition. And like I said, they couldn't manufacture this chair. And they worked at it. This is their apartment, the Eames apartment. And this is what they called the Kazam machine. They ran a line and pirated electricity straight off the pole because it was taking so much electricity. It had a bladder of an inflatable bladder that kind of helped create the shape. They were fooling with this again and again. We couldn't quite make the chair work, but they did make these splints work for the US Navy for World War II. And this is, this was an improvement on the metal splints that the Navy was using. The metal was cold, it was creating vibrations that were further causing problems for people who were injured in the war. So they created these that were softer, warmer, they supported the body in a better way. These holes created a space to be able to tie injuries in different directions. So they made about 150 of these, 150,000 of these. And that's where they were able to work out the design challenges in their original chair. What they came up with was this Eames LCW. It was produced by Herman Miller. And in fact, Bertoia was working with them when they were first working on this design. And he's the one that said, if we break this into two pieces rather than a single piece, it makes it much easier to manufacture. And it did. And we see it here at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in her home. But the chair that is kind of fun from the Georgia O'Keeffe is actually one of his fiberglass chairs. The fiberglass was an experiment. It was being used by the Zenith Plastics it had a fiberglass shell and then a fabric in plastic over a resin over a fiberglass blanket that was used in radar domes on planes during the war. And so Herman Miller and the Eames and Zenith Plastics experimented with a design for a chair. And that's what eventually evolved into these. There were interchangeable bases, and you can see the rocking chair. There was a height for table dining that are armless, and there's one that has arms with this lower base, which is only 13 inches. This chair became very, very popular, different from the Bauhaus colors, which were primary colors. Mid-century modern were based on organic colors, the colors of trees and wood and sky. And they were very popular and they sold quite a bit. This was, for those of us close to my age, these were in every school and university. These stacked up, so they were economical and easy to store. And these hooks on either side could gang them and make long, straight rows of chairs. But the one at Georgia O'Keeffe is interesting in that I've talked extensively with Oscar Fitzgerald about this as well. This is a chair that combination, you bought the seat and you bought the legs separately, the base, but there is no advertising of this particular combination of the armless version of the chair, which is upholstered in this one, and the low base. This is this tag that's underneath the Georgia O'Keeffe version of this chair. And it says, for dear Georgia, C+R Eames with a heart, 1979. The interesting thing about 1979 is it was the year after Charles Eames died. And according to Newhart's in their book with Ray Eames, during this time, 1979, until her death in 88, she was distributing the prototypes to various museums. And we believe that perhaps this might be one of the original prototypes that they gave to Georgia O'Keeffe. They were friends with Georgia O'Keeffe, and we don't ever see this. I haven't yet seen it advertised with this low base. It's always with the arms. At the Library of Congress, there's a letter from Georgia O'Keeffe, a note that says, Dear Ray, I want to thank you for helping Susan get the chair she gave me, and that it's the smallest and best chair in her room. Susan was a mystery to me until I started to realize that Susan is actually their friends Alexander and Susan Gerard. This is the chair that she would have seen at their house. The Eames were very good friends with the Gerards because they both worked at Herman Miller. This is the original cover that was developed for this chair, and it has the lower base. Georgia O'Keeffe was a petite in size, and so the lower was better. There's the Eames. Another Eames chair that you probably know. And now let's take questions. I'm a little over.
No worries at all. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. We've had some great responses under our Q&A. Janice just recently said, thank you for sharing such terrific information. Learning much from you today. So we'll start in with some questions. The first one we received was from Tracy, and she said, is the Vasily chair comfortable?
You know, that's funny. I used to own one, and ergonomics weren't taken too much into the design, except in a way it is. Once you're in the chair, It is comfortable. The leather gives enough of a give, and you tilt back a little bit so it supports your back, but it's very hard to get in and out of. And a lot of architects put them in their waiting rooms during the 20th century, and they're really hard, I can tell you, with a skirt to get in and out of that chair gracefully.
Yeah, I always think about that as well. That was a great question. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for answering. We also have another question from Linda Marie Grosso. She says, thank you for this wonderful grounding. Could you talk about how sculptures in particular were responding to the international style and creating sculpture like the furniture to enhance the architecture?
Well, I can speak to Bertoia because he was working in both design for interiors and as an artist. And there was a lot of use because of this big open space. There was a lot of use with sculptural panels that created dividers in space. And there's some famous ones by Bertoia that were used widely and manufactured, but even back as far as Eileen Gray with lacquered panels, early modernism. And also the Eames created panels. The panels were also created with textiles.
Great. Thank you so much. Sorry, I'm just looking through here. There's a lot to look through. We had some questions about Frank Lloyd Wright specifically.
Yes.
So this is kind of a two-parter. Matt asked, any thoughts on the Frank Lloyd Wright influence, since he and O'Keefe were friends, and both came from central Wisconsin?
Yeah.
And then Ryan also asked, where does Frank Lloyd Wright fit into this? Was he predating most of this, or was he not a modernist?
He was a modernist. He's an older generation, and he very definitely was. And I struggled with that as I was putting this together, of how much to focus on Frank Lloyd Wright, and decided to narrow the focus as it related to the furniture, George O'Keefe. But his work became, he very much had the same philosophy as Saarinen, in that the tables, the chairs, should relate to the architecture, should be considered as a complete. He was also working at the same time as the designers, Glasgow, Mackintosh, with very straight, tall backs to furniture. And even though we think about modern as kind of starting in the 20s, it really did begin earlier with in Glasgow and Vienna, and with Frank Lloyd Wright in the United States.
Thank you so much. Another question about sort of influence. We asked, S. Bauer asked if Georgia O'Keeffe, or if you know if she was influenced by Japanese aesthetics as well.
Well, I'm not an expert in art. So I know there's I can't speak to her, but I know that there is influence of that more pared down to essential things, to the line and the material being as important as the design itself, that the material should be a highlight of the design, and that is an idea that continues from the late 19th century all the way through to through modern.
Yes, good answer. And I can say, in terms of her art style, she was a bit influenced by that Japanese ideology. So it's not a big stretch. I'm looking for a question that could be our very last question. We have a lot of thank yous from participants. So they really enjoyed the talk and your time and insights. Let's see. Lots of thank yous. I guess we can end on, if you know any more information about the sculpture in O'Keeffe's bedroom, or maybe,
I don't know much about
okay.
that.
And then, okay, here's a good one. Aside from the Guide to Easier Living, any other recommended reads/books on modern furnishings/interior design?
Yes, and I pulled from a lot of them, and that's partly the reason I put my email up here, is if you would like an abbreviated bibliography of what I think are the best books that relate to the talk that I gave today, I would be happy to provide those. So just contact me on that email list, and I am happy. There's a lot of really great books.
Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. We really appreciate your time and your insights. It was a wonderful, wonderful lecture.
Thank you. Thank you. It was such a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks to everybody who joined us.
Of course, yes. Thank you to everyone. If we weren't able to answer some of your questions, we're so sorry, but you can send them in to contact@o'keeffemuseum.org if they are very pressing, and we'll make sure to get you an answer as quickly as we can. Thanks once again for joining, and have a wonderful morning/afternoon wherever you may be. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.